Topic 1. The electrical storm. Why the brain surges as you die. You imagine death as a silence, a gradual dimming of light, a slow unraveling of thought until there is nothing. But that's not what happens. What actually happens is the opposite, a storm. A violent, uncontrolled surge of electricity courses through your brain as the rest of your body gives up. In your final moments, your brain becomes more alive than it ever was in life. This surge isn't poetic, it's measurable. In 2013, researchers studying rats found that in the 30 seconds following cardiac arrest, there was a sharp spike in brain activity. Not just noise, organized patterns, synchronized across both hemispheres, stronger than anything recorded during waking consciousness. Later human studies, like the 2023 EEG recordings of terminal patients, confirmed it. Gamma waves, associated with perception, memory, and consciousness, spiked during and even after clinical death. As the body goes dark, the brain lights up like a solar flare. This final burst is called the transient surge of synchronized brain activity, and it is not a hallucination. It's real. It is the last time your brain is trying to make sense of a world it no longer belongs to. Perhaps it is the ultimate act of resistance against the void. Or perhaps it's the brain collapsing in on itself, its neural networks firing uncontrollably, no longer guided by oxygen or intention. Your neurons, now starved of glucose and oxygen, begin to leak. Membranes break down. Calcium floods the cell and triggers a death spiral. Excitotoxicity, they call it. Cells don't die peacefully. They burn. They fire themselves into oblivion, dragging down the systems they once served. The organ that made you turns on itself with an electrical scream. There are theories. Some suggest the brain, sensing death, attempts one last integrative function to create meaning from the chaos. Others propose that the surge is an artifact of failure, a beautiful failure, but failure nonetheless. Still others argue that this is when consciousness becomes untethered, the last broadcast of the self before the signal goes dark. You think you are a stable, coherent being. But what if you're just the harmony between 1,000 conflicting systems, circuits suppressing circuits? And when the suppression ends, the real you emerges, fractured, burning, involuntary? And here's where the paradox begins. If consciousness is strongest at the moment of death, then what exactly are you during life? A shadow? A rehearsal? A crude anticipation of that one final, perfect, terrifying thought. You want to believe this surge is beautiful, a last gift of final clarity, the soul rising. But it's not beauty. It's feedback. It's noise. It's the brain, desperate, failing alive. And if you're your brain, then in those moments of collapse, those final bursts, are you finally free or just finally exposed? What does it mean that your most intense moment of aliveness may only arrive once you're already dead? Topic 2. The default mode network, the disintegration of self. Close your eyes. The voice inside your head that just said, that voice isn't you. It's a network, a circuit, a fragile hum in the back of your skull known as the default mode network. It runs when you're not focused on the outside world, when you daydream, recall the past, imagine the future, or spiral inwards toward that horrible, repeating word, me. And when you die, that's one of the first things to go. The default mode network, DMN, links the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, among others. These aren't just regions of the brain. They are the architecture of introspection. Every regret, every identity, every ego loop you've ever suffered. That's the DMN spinning its recursive web. In 2012, researchers using fMRI and PET scans found that the DMN collapses under psychedelics like psilocybin and DMT. The self dissolves. Boundaries vanish. Many report a kind of death. Not metaphorically, neurologically. This disintegration mirrors, disturbingly well, what happens in the brain during the final stages of dying. As oxygen disappears and neural firing becomes erratic, the default mode network unravels. The part of you that says, "This is me," stops. You will not die as yourself. You will die as fragments, unstitched memories, hallucinated geometry, a scattered mind no longer able to cohere into a center. The self is not a core. It is an agreement, a temporary illusion of stability produced by internal narration. And when the DMN fails, the narrator falls silent. This is what mystics call ego death, what scientists call network collapse, what you might call the final relief or the final horror. Without the DMN, you may still perceive, but not as you. You may experience, but without identity. A raw stream of sensory nonsense, vivid, eternal, and unsorted. Studies in terminal brain function show that this dissolution is not passive. It is turbulent. It comes with a collapse of memory integration, an unthreading of time, a breakdown in the ability to tell where you begin and the rest of the world ends. There's no longer a self looking at the world. There is only sensation devouring itself. You're not a mind trapped in a body. You are a loop of internal narration pretending to be real. And that loop is already weakening. Every time you lose focus, every dream without an eye, every dissociative drift. Those are previews of the final disconnection. Not death. Something worse. The death of the one who knew they were dying. There's a reason terminal patients sometimes report serenity. It's not peace, it's subtraction. The self erodes. The burden of I am dissolves into the freedom of there is. It's not enlightenment. It's neurological collapse interpreted as transcendence. But here's the deeper cruelty. The DMN doesn't disappear all at once. It degrades. You forget your name. Your memories blur. You try to grab hold of your identity like catching smoke in a storm. But the storm doesn't care. You aren't you anymore. You're watching someone die, and that someone is watching nothing. So what remains when the self collapses, but consciousness flickers on? What happens when you die, but experience doesn't? Topic 3. The coolness of time. When seconds refuse to die. You think time is fixed. You think it flows forward, minute by minute, hour by hour, dragging you toward death like a current too strong to fight. But you're wrong. Time doesn't move. You move through it, and your brain, terrified of stillness, invents the illusion of its passing. But in death, that invention fails. In moments of trauma, fear, or extreme physiological stress, time slows. Or it stops. Ask anyone who's been in a car accident, fallen from a great height, or teetered on the edge of death. They'll tell you the same story. Time dilated, stretched, distorted. But what they really mean is that their brain could no longer measure it the way it was taught to. The mechanism isn't supernatural, it's neurological. The amygdala, which processes fear, ramps up activity. The locus coeruleus releases norepinephrine. The brain goes into overdrive, storing information with obsessive detail. And the more information you remember, the longer the moment feels in retrospect. Time doesn't slow down. Your memory speeds up. But the edge of death, this effect becomes monstrous. When the default mode network collapses and the prefrontal cortex begins to shut down, time loses its anchor. Studies of near-death experiences and terminal EEG patterns show chaotic surges in gamma waves, brain rhythms linked to consciousness and perception. There is no consistent timeline. The beginning blurs with the end. Seconds become eternities, or eternities become less than a breath. This is why survivors of cardiac arrest often describe feeling as though they were outside of time. Not metaphorically, literally dislocated from temporal order. Some report reliving entire lifetimes in moments. Others say they watch time collapse into a loop. Others still describe a timelessness so complete that they lost all sense of ever having been alive in the first place. The paradox is unbearable. You experience time most vividly when it breaks. In dreams, in trauma, in death. What does that say about time's reality, or your brain's ability to know it? Einstein called time an illusion. Block theory posits that all moments already exist, that the past, present, and future are equally real, and your experience of movement through them is nothing but the flickering of your brain's projector. But if that's true, then what is dying? Not the end of a timeline, but the brain's final failure to move between the frames. Like a film jammed in the reel, melting under the heat of the bulb. And still it gets worse. Because if the brain loses its grip on time, you might never know you've died. You could be trapped in the final moment forever. A loop of collapsing time, your last thoughts spiraling inward, repeating, unable to reach an end that no longer exists. People who've suffered cardiac arrest and been revived often say the same thing. It felt like an eternity. But what if it wasn't just a feeling? What if that eternity is still happening somewhere in the shattered mirror of time their brains left behind? What if you are already there, stuck in your own neurological echo, dying forever in a moment that won't move? So tell me, how do you know this isn't a loop? Topic 4. The memory flood. Your life never flashes before your eyes. You've heard the story. At the edge of death, your life flashes before your eyes. A montage of your first kiss, your mother's voice, a childhood birthday, the smell of rain on hot pavement. All of it, suddenly and without warning, pouring into your mind like a collapsing dam. But that's not what happens. What floods your brain is not your life. It's what your brain wants you to believe was your life. In the final moments, memories are not retrieved. They're reassembled, distorted, compressed, invented. The hippocampus, which encodes memory, is one of the first brain regions to suffer oxygen starvation. Its circuits don't produce clarity. They produce noise, fragments, overlapping images without origin. Researchers studying near-death experiences, NDEs, in cardiac arrest survivors have reported memory phenomena that are striking not in their accuracy, but in their unreliability. The images people recall are often emotionally weighted, symbolically warped, or entirely nonlinear. A dead brother speaks in the voice of a former teacher. A hospital corridor blurs into a hallway from childhood. Time unravels, and memory follows. This isn't recall. It's a neurological hallucination built from the last functioning pieces of a dying mind. The cortex, grasping for familiarity as it shuts down, throws together meaning from chaos. You're not reliving your life. You're watching it be rewritten in real time by a brain that's forgotten how to tell the truth. Some suggest this is a defense mechanism, the mind's last attempt to find meaning or comfort or resolution. But the truth is simpler and darker. It's not that your brain wants to comfort you. It's that it no longer knows what's real. The filter between imagination and memory collapses. Autobiographical details tangle with dreams, regrets, confessions, and faces you've never met. You become a museum of false exhibits curated by a curator that's already gone. Studies using fMRI scans during deep meditative and psychedelic states, both neurologically adjacent to dying, show the same pattern, a hyperconnectivity between regions that don't usually communicate. Visual cortex bleeds into emotion centers. Memory networks leak into the default mode network. The result? Surreal, vivid narratives that feel more real than reality itself. That's what your death montage really is. Not a flash, not a summary, a lie. Beautiful, haunting, and meticulously crafted by a brain in free fall. And it doesn't end cleanly, because some of these final constructions might not be momentary. The flood might not recede. If time perception dissolves and your self has fragmented, then the flood is your new reality. Your dying thought becomes your only thought. You are trapped in your own collapsing story. What if, right now, you are inside your final memory, watching a fictional version of yourself try to recall something that never happened? What if your entire sense of life was just your brain's final scream to remind itself that it ever existed? So ask yourself, how many of your memories are already lies your brain told you to survive the death it cannot escape? And if you can't trust your memory, how do you know you were ever alive at all? Topic 5. The sensory disassembly, when the world stops making sense. Touch the table. Smell the air. Listen to the hum beneath silence. You think the world is real because your senses tell you so. But your senses are not cameras. They're not recorders. They are stories, twisted, filtered, and reconstructed by a brain that never touches the world it claims to know. And in death, that reconstruction fails. Not gently, not peacefully, but violently, piece by piece, until all sensation becomes betrayal. The process is called cortical disinhibition, a catastrophic breakdown in the brain's ability to suppress irrelevant or conflicting sensory information. In life, your sensory cortices filter billions of inputs. They prioritize, they compare, they keep the world coherent. But in the minutes before death, as oxygen fades and neurons misfire, those filters fall apart. Sensory input doesn't stop, it overwhelms. That's why dying is often described as surreal. Why the room shifts shape. Why sound stretch. Why light becomes unbearable. It's not because reality changes. It's because your brain is no longer capable of organizing it. You become blind, not from darkness, but from too much light. Deaf, not from silence, but from sensory overload that no longer makes meaning. People report hearing voices, whispers, or choirs, not because of ghosts or spirits, but because the auditory cortex begins interpreting neural noise as signal. The same way a broken radio turns static into pattern. You don't hear death. You hallucinate it, and you believe what you hear because there's no longer a system in place to correct the hallucination. The same is true for vision. Studies on retinal ischemia, when blood flow to the eye is interrupted, show that in the final seconds, people often see tunnels, lights, or geometries. These are not gateways. They are your visual cortex starving, gasping out imagery in one last desperate flare. The peripheral vision collapses first, creating the illusion of a tunnel. Then colors emerge, not from light, but from electrical dysfunction. In other words, the light at the end of the tunnel is you, watching your own perception collapse. But worse than what you see or hear is what you feel. Touch, balance, temperature, all begin to fail in disconnected layers. The somatosensory cortex, overloaded and confused, feeds the illusion of floating or melting or being pulled. You aren't leaving your body. Your body is no longer able to tell where it begins and ends. What we call out-of-body experiences aren't mysteries. They're neurological failures of spatial awareness. The temporoparietal junction, which helps map your body in space, begins to misfire. You drift above yourself because your brain no longer knows what self means. The illusion of separation is your brain's final attempt to hold onto orientation. And it doesn't last, because after this, after the visuals, the sounds, the distortions, comes the blankness, the real void, a point beyond sensory input, not silence, but the absolute loss of reference. No color, no voice, no direction, no language. Just stillness so complete that the absence becomes a kind of scream. You don't fade into nothingness. You fall into a reality where your brain is still functioning, but has lost every tool it used to tell you where you are. A conscious experience without context, a perception without anything to perceive. And if perception is how the brain builds the world, then what is a world without perception? Are you gone? Or are you just lost? And worse, what if you've already been here before? What if every moment of silence, of déjà vu, of spiritual dissociation was your brain brushing against this void and recoiling in fear? So now, tell me, how do you know the world hasn't already vanished? Topic 6. The DMT hypothesis, the chemical that unmakes the world. There's a molecule produced deep in the body that can dissolve your sense of self, erase your understanding of time, and flood your consciousness with visions so vivid they feel more real than anything you've ever seen with open eyes. It is not fantasy. It is not myth. It is N-dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a substance that exists both in exotic plants and, unsettlingly, in the human brain. And some believe it is released at the moment of death. This is the DMT hypothesis, that in your final moments, your brain floods itself with its own psychedelic. That this is not a mistake, but an evolutionary feature. That the death trip is chemical. DMT has been called the spirit molecule, but its effects are not ethereal. They are clinical, ingested in large doses, either synthetically or via ayahuasca. It induces rapid onset hallucinations, ego dissolution, time distortion, and encounters with impossible geometries, entities, or otherworldly landscapes. Users report leaving their bodies, moving through tunnels, meeting beings of light, or entering alien dimensions. But those aren't spiritual experiences. They're the brain's response to neurological overload, an endogenous compound interfering with the very architecture of your perception. DMT works by binding to serotonin receptors, especially 5-HT2A, in the visual cortex, prefrontal regions, and the limbic system. In short, it hijacks the brain's interpretive framework, not to destroy it, but to melt it. A 2019 study found measurable levels of DMT in the brains of dying rats, suggesting it may be produced endogenously in significant quantities under extreme stress or hypoxia. The pineal gland, long mythologized as the seat of the soul, has enzymes capable of producing DMT. While the evidence in humans is inconclusive, the possibility alone is terrifying. That your final experience of reality is a drug trip scripted by your own biology. But why? Evolution has no interest in beauty. So what is the function of this chemical hallucination? Some argue it's a comfort mechanism, a way to ease the terror of death. But that's an assumption born of ignorance. Anyone who's truly entered the DMT space knows it is not always kind. It does not obey logic or morality. It does not care what you want to see. It shows you what your brain has buried. It shows you the raw code of perception without filters. It is not a dream. It is hyperreality, a space where symbols move, time reverses, and your sense of self unravels like a thread caught in the teeth of a machine. If DMT is released at death, then what you experience isn't your soul leaving your body. It's your brain caught in a final loop of unspeakable, recursive hallucination. You don't rise into the light. You fall into your own unfiltered mind, and it might feel eternal. What happens if your final moment is an infinite psychedelic spiral? What happens when your dying brain, unmoored from linear time, experiences this trip as forever? And worse, what if this molecule does? Topic 7. The fear circuit, death, dread, and the brain's oldest scream. You feel fear in your stomach, your chest, your throat. But it doesn't start there. It starts deeper, farther back in your skull, in a primitive, almond-shaped structure that doesn't know language or reason. The amygdala. It does not think. It detects. It reacts. And when it senses death, it doesn't panic. It activates ancient terror hardwired across millions of years of evolution. The amygdala isn't afraid of dying. It's built to scream as you die. The amygdala and its fear network, linked to the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the insular cortex, lights up when you're in danger, when you're about to fall, when you hear a scream, when you see a corpse, when you remember your own childhood trauma. This network doesn't distinguish real from imagined threat. It only knows perceived annihilation and death. Death is the perfect trigger, but death is also the paradox the brain can never truly grasp. Because the amygdala, like every structure in your brain, evolved to keep you alive, yet it also must face the fact that survival is a statistical impossibility, that every signal it sends will one day fail, that one day it will scream, and nothing will come to stop what's coming. What does it mean to be wired for survival when extinction is inevitable? In patients with Urbach-Wiethe disease, a rare condition that calcifies and disables the amygdala, fear vanishes. Not metaphorically, literally. These individuals cannot feel terror, even when held at gunpoint or suffocating. Their brains no longer interpret threat. They walk through hell and call it curiosity. Now reverse the condition. Imagine an amygdala in hyperactivation, as happens during trauma or at the edge of death. Studies of patients undergoing cardiac arrest, drowning, or suffocation show overwhelming activation in limbic regions. The mind doesn't blank. It bursts. The fear becomes so intense that it detaches from emotion and becomes a kind of surreal clarity. This is why people sometimes report a peaceful calm during near-death. It's not peace. It's neurochemical paralysis. It's the brain's last resort to stop itself from exploding. A cocktail of opioids and endocannabinoids flood the system, not to ease you, but to mute the existential scream long enough for you to die with your eyes open. You want to believe fear ends when death begins. But that's not true. The fear system outlives the rest of your cognition. It is primal, subcortical, resilient. It may keep firing even after higher consciousness has faded. Even after your sense of self is gone, your brain may still feel terror, a blind, howling dread with no center to experience it. That's the nightmare. Not that you die, but that your brain, even as it dissolves, continues to fire the alarms, and no one is left inside to hear them. And worse, what if every moment of anxiety you've ever felt wasn't fear of death, but memory of it? What if dread is the echo of your brain remembering what it has already done over and over in timelines that folded in on themselves? What if the fear you carry isn't yours? Topic 8. The ego's collapse. You die before you die. There's a moment you won't notice when it happens, because the one meant to notice it is already gone. Your body may still breathe, your neurons may still fire, your heart may beat a few more times, but you'll have already died. The ego, your identity, your history, your preferences, your name, will have disintegrated long before your organs surrender. You think death is physical. It's not. It's hierarchical, and the first to fall is always the one you believed was permanent, the self. The ego isn't a soul. It isn't even an organ. It's a cognitive hallucination maintained by the default mode network, the prefrontal cortex, and their recursive storytelling loops. Every time you refer to yourself, every moment you reflect, judge, or plan, you're not accessing a self, you're constructing one. A temporary hallucination of continuity strung together from fragments. And in death, that hallucination breaks. This isn't speculation. It's observed. It's replicable. Under deep meditation, during ego-dissolving psychedelic trips, in cases of trauma or psychosis, and in fMRI studies of patients nearing death, the ego vanishes. Identity fractures. Thought becomes sensation. Memory detaches from narrative. The I collapses into a raw, formless witnessing that no longer remembers who it's witnessing for. Why? Because the structures that maintain ego are fragile. They require blood, oxygen, stability, hierarchy. When the brain begins to fail through hypoxia, trauma, or neurochemical flood, the upper networks collapse first. Selfhood isn't foundational. It's the top floor of the tower, and it crumbles as soon as the ground shakes. You will not get to die as yourself. You will die as a flickering sequence of impressions. A hand on a bed rail, a flashing light, a noise with no language, a sensation that once meant grief. You will be conscious, perhaps, but you will not be you. This is why ego death is reported in both psychedelic experiences and near-death events. Not because death reveals truth, but because both destroy the machinery that filters the truth. The ego doesn't let you see reality. It edits it, makes it tolerable, shapes it into stories that you can survive. When the ego dies, those filters fall away. You see everything, and none of it belongs to you. The Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks of Bardo, the in-between space, the ego's unraveling. The place where the self must witness itself dissolve and mistake it for divine encounter. But neuroscience has no Bardo. It has collapse. It has entropy. It has noise where there once was narration. And still you cling. You imagine you will face death bravely, that you will know it, but you won't, because you'll already be gone. This is the deeper cruelty. You don't get to attend your own death. Your ego will have vanished before your body even understands what's happening. You are absent from your own ending. There is no witness, no narrator, only a brain in free fall, misfiring images, memories, and sensations that no longer belong to anyone. So ask yourself, if you aren't there to die, who exactly is it happening to? And worse, what if this ego collapse isn't a glitch of death, but a glimpse of what you've always been? Topic 9. The illusion of control. How choice dies before the body. You think you have agency. You think death is something you'll face, prepare for, even resist. But that's the final illusion. Not that you die, but that you ever had a choice in the first place. Free will dies long before your body does. Not metaphorically, neurologically. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that shattered our understanding of volition. He asked participants to perform simple actions, pressing a button, while recording their brain activity. What he found was devastating. The brain's readiness potential, a signal that it was about to initiate an action, fired hundreds of milliseconds before the participant became consciously aware of deciding. In other words, the brain decided before you did. The self didn't choose. It rationalized. It observed the decision after it had already occurred and told a story to make it feel like choice. That was the first crack in the myth of free will. Then came more. Studies using functional MRI can now predict decisions seconds before you're aware of them. Your choice of which button to press, which image you prefer, even whether you'll say yes or no. The implications are unbearable. Every decision you've ever made, what to eat, who to love, whether to believe in God or not, was not made by you. It was made by a cascade of neural firings, genetic predispositions, environmental programming, and sensory distortions. The you that takes credit is a narrator, not a driver. Now add death into this equation. You imagine death as your final moment of clarity, a place where you choose acceptance, courage, or resistance. But the prefrontal cortex, which governs judgment and complex decision-making, is one of the first to fail during terminal decline. The brainstem, automatic, primitive, keeps going. The body fights or folds. But you aren't in control. You're not even consulted. Patients in end-of-life states, ICUs, trauma wards, hospice, often display erratic behavior. Agitation, thrashing, sudden stillness. These aren't reactions. They're reflexes, movements without volition. The illusion of agency continues even when there is no one left to act. And here's where the recursive horror unfolds. Even in life, control was an illusion. Your beliefs, your fears, your plans for death, they were conditioned responses to stimuli you never chose. Evolution doesn't want you to see the machinery. It wants you to believe in the myth of autonomy until the machine breaks down. You are not the one choosing how you die. You're not even the one choosing how you live. You are the observation of a system that simulates choice to maintain coherence. And when coherence fails, when systems shut down, when cells go dark, when oxygen slips away, you don't resist. You perform resistance. You echo it. You hallucinate it. You believe in a version of yourself that was never really steering anything. So what does that make you? A marionette? A projection? A late echo in the hall of your own extinction? And here's the last twist. If your choices were never yours, if death is already coded into every motion you've ever made, was there ever anything to lose in the first place? So now ask yourself, not if you're dying, but if you ever lived at all. Topic 10. Consciousness without witness. When you remain, but you're no one. There's something more terrifying than death. Not the moment your heart stops, or the brain ceases electrical activity, or the lungs go still. No, the deeper terror is this, that consciousness might outlast identity, that something in you continues but not you. This isn't a mystical idea. It's a scientific nightmare. In 2014, researchers observed residual brain activity in patients after clinical death. The electrical surges weren't signs of recovery, but of persistence, gamma oscillations, and cross-network synchrony occurring up to minutes after cardiac arrest. Not signs of life, signs of experience without agency, awareness with no self to hold it. This isn't rare. It's replicable. It's been seen in rodents, in humans, in the dying cortex, and the brainstem. There are flickers, coherent, organized patterns that appear after death. They don't indicate thinking, but something worse, the scaffolding of experience with no content, no language, no memory, no person. You are not your brain. You are what your brain makes possible, the emergent illusion of being someone. But that illusion depends on structure, the default mode network, the prefrontal regions, the thalamic relay. And these do not all die at once. Death isn't a light switch. It's a cascade. The self is the first to fall, then memory, then language, then spatial orientation, then emotion, then, maybe, the final thing, the bare field of awareness. What Buddhists might call pure consciousness. But there's no serenity here, no enlightenment, just the raw horror of being stripped of identity, time, and location. Some patients under anesthesia or deep comas report floating, watching, or being unable to move. Their EEGs show activity in brain regions that should be silent. This is called cognitive motor dissociation, the condition in which patients appear unresponsive but retain internal experience. It's not imagination. It's measurable. It means you could be awake inside your dying mind. And in those moments, you no longer know who you are. Not because you've forgotten, but because the you was never more than a pattern of connections. And now that pattern is broken. You're left with something more primitive. Not personhood, not thought, just presence. Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. Thomas Metzinger called it the phenomenal self model, the brain's simulation of self that experiences the world. But if the model breaks and experience continues, who or what is left? There is no one left to scream, no one to be afraid. Just the architecture of sensation, free of the one who used to interpret it. It's not peace. It's not suffering. It's not anything you can name. But here's the final fracture. If this structure of raw experience can exist without a self, then maybe it was never yours in the first place. Maybe your I was a misinterpretation, a passing glitch of interpretation layered over a field that was always impersonal. So then, what are you? And if awareness survives the death of identity, who exactly is dying?